So as we've already discussed, the idea of public reason provides a framework potentially for defending and justifying one's philosophy of education, or for that matter, any particular public proposal or recommendation. And as you recall, we argued that philosophical approach to education, or what one advocates as the right kind of education, is not only a personal matter, but it's also public, in that it's a normative, in that whatever we intend, education is an intentional activity, and those intentions need to be justified. We are attempting to influence and affect our students in certain ways. We have goals and objectives for them. It's purposeful. And those purposes, goals, objectives are normative in the sense that we're attempting to affect students in a certain way. And therefore they require justification. And one can have one's own personal reasons for adopting a philosophical approach to education. But because it's public, because education is a public good, and because we are often working in public schools, and that we're affecting future citizens, we also, one could argue, a public justification is required for one's philosophy. And the idea of public reason provides a framework for that justification. And the basic idea is that through public reason, we offer reasons for our proposal or our opinion or our recommendation to each other as citizens in terms that can be mutually recognizable among us. And we have a duty to each other, an obligation to each other, to offer terms of justification to each other in a language that is mutually recognizable and based upon shared values and principles. And so the values and principles, then we argue that the values and principles of a democratic ethic are generally shared in the culture, in our culture. The ideas of equality, liberty, etc., are fundamentally mutually recognizable and shared in the population, and therefore we could appeal to them as public reasons. So we can appeal to intrinsic equality, political equality, legal equality, equal opportunity. We can appeal to liberty, negative, positive, developmental liberty. We can appeal to the principles of non-repression and non-discrimination, which are important principles that operationalize equality and liberty, etc. So appeal to these values and principles provide us with public reasons for support for our position. So that's the general idea of public reason. We can have our own personal reasons, but offering public reasons is also essential, necessary for justification. So how do we go about using those values and principles in support or in rejection of a particular philosophical position? Well, there are at least two kinds of arguments that can be used. One of them is one type is a coherence type of argument, and a second type is our realization arguments, and I'll explain them. So a coherence argument or coherence arguments look for either a coherence between one's opinion, and a certain value or set of values and principles. So if the opinion or recommendation or your philosophical choice is consistent, and if you can demonstrate its consistency with a particular shared value or values or principles, then that provides validity to your position and provides justification for that position. So one can seek to demonstrate, for example, that one's educational purpose is consistent with and coherent with a particular, with equality or liberty, etc. So that's a type of argument that one can put forth, a coherence type of argument. Also, one could argue in rejection of a particular position, one could say that the position is inconsistent with a certain value or principle. So coherence arguments work in both directions. You can on the one hand demonstrate that your position is consistent with the principle. In other ways, you can mount an argument for the rejection of a competing position by demonstrating its inconsistency, that is, its incoherence with the value or principle. So an example might be, so you're looking for, you would ask, in terms of a positive coherence, you would ask, does my opinion cohere with public reasons? Another form of coherence argument is that of neglect. Does a particular, and this would be a refutation, a form of incoherence is that the philosophy neglects certain values, doesn't address them. Or a third kind of coherence argument is that it's blatantly, in your view, inconsistent with a certain value or principle. An example is a right to freedom of conscience. Is a right to freedom of conscience justifiable in terms of public reason? Generally, we would say yes. A right to freedom of conscience is consistent with intrinsic equality, political equality. It's consistent with negative and positive liberty. That is, if we denied someone the right to freedom of conscience, we would be violating their fundamental value, intrinsic value as a person. We would interrupt the equal consideration of their interests and the equal participation of their interests in the political process. Fundamentally, if we denied someone a right to freedom of conscience, we would be violating their negative liberty. It would be a form of coercion. It would violate their right to define and pursue their own conception of the good life. It would violate their right to be self-determining, to determine the course of their own life, if we denied them freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. So one could mount, in this example, a very strong argument in terms of public reason for freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, as an example. So that's one example, and those would be that would be example of a coherence argument, a type of argument used in public reason. So you would argue for its consistency and, if denied, its violation of fundamental values and principles. A second kind of argument is a realization argument, or realization argument. And this is different than coherence. It's to ask whether, in our case, a educational philosophy is suited to realize one of the core values or uh, of the democratic ethic. Is this, so we have these values. Is your position, your philosophical position, your prescription for education, with that, could you argue that that is a means to the realization of a value? Could you demonstrate that your goals are, and your means of educating are necessary for people to be free, to have negative liberty, positive liberty, to realize political equality, legal equality, etc. So this is it's different than coherence in its type of argument. It looks to whether your position, if you can demonstrate whether your position is a means to realize a fundamental value in the political culture. If so, if you can make that argument, then that justifies, that lends justification, validity and justification to your philosophical position. So an example might be in the humanist tradition that education should primarily or should expose to all students to the liberal arts and sciences. At the core of the curriculum should be the liberal arts and sciences. That's is that reasonable? Is that justifiable? And one could argue that it is justifiable because that exposure to the liberal arts and sciences, one could argue, will lead to the cultivation of capabilities necessary for the realization of liberty. That in order for an individual to live in freedom, they have to be able to define and pursue their own conception of the good life. And that exposure to the liberal arts and sciences will cultivate that capacity of conceiving and choosing a particular way of life that's suited to them. That without that exposure, they are not equipped to develop that capacity. One could argue in that thing. And that's an example. It would be of a realization type of argument. So one can mount at least two types of arguments broadly. A coherence, demonstrating one's position is coherent, consistent with, and competing positions are inconsistent with fundamental public reasons. Or one could argue, in terms of your philosophy of education being a means to realize fundamentally shared values. Question. Does that help at all? Or does that muddle the water? Okay. So one is logical consistency, the coherent argument. Is it consistent or not? Realization type argument is does it really serve as a means to the realization of the we can demonstrate that when you reach to that realization, then that gives you strong reason and other strong reasons for adopting. Or part of the realization argument is also that you have competing actually an impediment to the realization. So one part of argument is logical consistency, the other looks at outcomes, is outcome. Is this will your recommendation work? Will it lead to the achievement of some value? Does that understand? How else will we argue? Argue in the sense of supporting and justifying ideas. But they require justification. Oh, gee, why are you doing that? Oh, gee, everyone's doing it. It's the new fad. They're doing it in the next fad, so I'm not surprised. Do it to you too. You went to the physician. Well, Bill, I'm going to prescribe this to you. You need to. Oh, really? That's pretty silly. Why? Starting in the street. Oh, I don't know. Everyone's doing it. You know, everyone's having a gallbladder. You should too. You have a little indigestion. Remove the gallbladder. It's easy. Go to the top of the mountain. You'll feel that. For a while. Oh, that collecting gallbladder. You run out of the office. Sure. Same with us. Can we justify what we do? I'm not around saying we have to do. There are views that can be understood and accepted by others. We can appeal to scientific findings. Scientific findings are established scientific findings. But also we can appeal to psychology, for example, core findings of psychology. That all gets some time. If we appeal to our commonly shared democratic values and principles, then it's full of power. And we always do. And we can do that either by demonstrating consistency or demonstrating or advocating the support for the organization. What about justification to private? Well, what about shares? Because there are people who are all people. So what about I taught at a Christian school, private school. So there were some things that they would be okay with because it was a Christian school that maybe you know not okay with. I mean, is there anyone? Oh, certainly. Certainly. From private reasons you get the justification for it. And perhaps for other like-minded people. What if I don't share you with this religion? How is it? No, but those kids are future citizens of my society. I have an interest in education. In fact, you have an obligation to me to justify what you're doing with education. But you're all citizens. And that's my important. Here's society. So, remind me.
in the October, right, the 95, but the able to teach what they want. One reason, yeah, because public space reserved to regular national and state jurisdiction. How is that? So even the private school has to have social space in terms of the homeschool has to have social space. That's better way to do it. Crazy, wacky, super, outrageous religious school. Think of the West Florida houses, the one Calvin's yeah. They have a school. Because the state saying no, you're not, okay. It's just, I have to think. One would have to develop the government. Those kids are not only, certainly they have a right to the religious beliefs, that are given the Constitution, their character, life and life, and all of that, under liberty. You do not want to deny that. But yet they're going to be, they're also going to be citizens of a democracy with people that don't believe the same thing. So how are they going, so you would want them to be able to participate as an real interest in their being prepared to participate as citizens. And perhaps also join in the consensus around shared community together, even in most places here in I do not raise bad public don't, that's a, no, I don't know. So much, people are thinking. But I might, going to the school, I'm not sure. Certainly violating some of the opportunity. They stop there with there's a famous quote that the state of Wisconsin mandated the attendance of all children or all youth in first year of high school. The Amish said, we're not going to send our kids to the high school. According to our religious and cultural beliefs, all formal education should stop at the age of the state of Wisconsin argues that attendance is mandatory because while we respect religion and the right to freedom of conscience, these students are future citizens of our state. Maybe should be education. We also have a right to be exposed and ground liberty as well. So we have a right to be exposed to different ideas. The world, the ideas out there, and we have a right to be exposed. curriculum. You should be exempt from reading, I forgot what books they were, the text libraries before, on religious grounds. The parents argued that these books violation either religious sensibility or Christian, fundamental Christian faith. We argued, as I said, many fundamentalist Christian parents thought reading was very popular. I thought that was something like that. I wasn't because it was good for us. So then the school district said, no. If your child is in this school, they will read the book. Part of the curriculum. I'm not going to change the curriculum for individual students. Everyone is going to read the curriculum. So the parents took the school district court on grounds of religion. The court ruled in favor of the school on grounds that it did rise to a violation of religious freedom. That the parents could remove their students for certain things. With the homeschooling and homeschooling violation. That's never been able to doctrine. Similar case in some ways. On the grounds that it's a public school, and the public curriculum, generally a separate text, generally every child. And then you do have to guide it. Maybe allow every parent to contest the curriculum. So do you want to do some discussion? As an exercise, I think it might be helpful to discuss the two kinds of arguments. So construct, put forth a coherent argument for and or against conservative treatment. So appeal to a coherent argument, but also provide a realization argument for and against conservative treatment. And spell it out and be prepared to share that with the other side. Can you use metaphor? That sounds a copy, but I don't know how to read it. Did you get a copy? Would you like me to email that to you or put it in the draft? Email. Making the calling for the ones who get back 2 weeks over there. Boys, we're done.